Hey guys, welcome back. This is Jeep Sheep TV, and today we are doing a deep dive into the science behind this Power Commander 3 made by Dynojet.
Alright.
Before we get started, I'm going to reference another video that I'll be coming out with shortly, which is where I baseline this engine. And what I mean by that is I'm just taking a little bit of data to give you guys an idea as to what I'm starting with, so that way we're not going to skew anything you might see on your engine. For starters, my compression ratio. I have 4 cylinders, and the 4 cylinders are running at roughly 140 to 150 psi, which is right where they're supposed to be. On top of that, I have a fuel pressure of 30 psi up to 38 psi, 30 being at idle. This is idle and we're right at 30 psi. And 38 being at a more open throttle position, or when the engine demands more power. This again is very normal parameters. So all I'm telling you is that my engine's in good running condition, and that the data that you're seeing here should be transferable to your engine if yours is in good running condition as well. I know that a lot of you are here because you want to know if the Power Commander 3 adds power to the Jeep. And I'm going to tell you, but first you need to sit through a little bit of the science behind it, because I need you to understand what's going on here. Not every Jeep's going to be the same, and you need to know the nuts and bolts before you do something to your fuel parameters and change how your engine is running. I would hate for you to break something or wear something out early. So stay till the end, and we're going to talk about some 0 to 60 tests that I've done finally. I should tell you some of the modifications that I've done to this engine. Some in particular that pertain to the air-fuel ratio, which is what we're studying today. The first one being the injectors. Now, the injectors that I have are a 4-hole Bosch injector intended for a Ford vehicle. And after doing some research, I determined that those injectors push out 15% less fuel per pressure. And so all that's saying is, as you're opening up this solenoid inside the fuel injector, it's going to allow 15% less fuel through the injector than the Jeep fuel injectors that came with this vehicle. So that's 15% less fuel. Now, I also have a 4-liter throttle body, and now what the 4-liter throttle body is going to do is it's not going to necessarily change the total amount of air that I can get into my engine, but it is going to change the total amount of air that I get into my engine per throttle position. And this is important because a lot of the engine's computing system understands per throttle position. It's looking at where your foot is, what you're demanding. Now what we're seeing is an increase in air. So we're going to do some math real quick. The 2.5 liter, which is this engine, has a throttle body, a stock throttle body of 48 millimeters. 48 millimeters. And that's the diameter. And this is the 2.5. The 4-liter has a 55 millimeter diameter throttle body. Now, if we know area to be equal to pi times the radius squared, then we can find the area of these two things. Now, I can work out this math, or I can just tell you, and that's what I'll opt for. So the 2.5 liter has an area of 1808.64 millimeters, and that's squared because it's an area. And the 4.0 has a area of 2374.625 millimeters squared. Now, if you divide one by the other, actually, we'll flip that. We'll divide 2,374 by 1808. So imagine you're flipping that. You're going to end up with a number that looks a lot like this, 1.31. And that is a 31% increase. That's all that really means. It's 1 and then 31%. If we say that this is 31% more air, then we could say that our air to fuel ratio is going to be increasing by 31%. And up here, if we have less fuel, and so let's make this visual. Air to fuel is saying air per fuel. So if we increase this number, then the output number, which is the air fuel ratio, is going to increase. If we increase this number, then it would decrease. But that's not what we're doing. We have less fuel, so we're decreasing the amount of fuel, which is going to increase the air to fuel ratio. So now what you're going to end up with is 46%. 46% more air than before. More air per fuel. This math is telling us that we now have 46% more air than fuel in this engine by these two modifications. And that would make this thing incredibly lean. There's no way that it would be able to run. How does this make any sense? Well, there's two things. One is fluid flow is not that cut and dry. There's losses all over the place, and there is no way that we're seeing a 31% increase in air due to just changing the throttle body. That's not feasible in a scientific world. But for argument's sake, let's pretend that it is. The engine would not be able to run. However, this is a fuel-injected engine, which means that it has a computer controlling the fuel injection. It has two modes. One is called open loop and one is called closed loop. Open loop means that it has a parameter set. So it says this much air is coming in, we're going to apply this much fuel. It doesn't check to make sure it's right. It just says for this much air, we're going to put in this much fuel. And it's going to do that based upon maybe the throttle position, the map sensor, maybe the inlet air temperature. Some of those things are what it's going to read to determine how much fuel to push in there. But it still has no idea what it's actually doing, which is when you get to closed loop, which all that's saying is it's saying that it's reading another sensor. So it makes a decision, it reads the sensor tells it something, and then it makes a decision based on that. It's a closed loop communication. So this engine, like I said, has open and closed loop. Open loop is usually around idle, and it's also for acceleration or other certain very specific parameters where they know the engine's going to need something very specific. Closed loop uses the oxygen sensor, the O2 sensor, which if you haven't seen it yet, there's a Bread to Loaf video on installing an O2 sensor on his Buick. He does a beautiful job at explaining what that thing actually does and what it is. So I highly encourage you to go on our channel page to the Bread to Loaf playlist and watch that video because I found it enjoyable and I hope you will too. Anyway, the closed loop scenario, it says I'm going to push X amount of fuel in. Then it checks the oxygen sensor, and the oxygen sensor says, whoa, you are way rich or you're way lean, and then it adjusts based on that. And eventually it's going to find itself in a happy middle. Now I hope to create a video visualizing what this is, but really what's happening is the oxygen sensor is very binary. It says either you're rich or you're lean, and then it has to adjust based on that. It doesn't give a very precise measurement, and so the engine's going to kind of adjust over the parameters until it eventually levels out and gets to where it needs to be at a good stoichiometric air to fuel ratio, which is just saying that's the most efficient burn chemically. Okay, whoa, now I spoke a ton of science at you and you're probably just wishing you didn't click on this video. Let's show you what I'm talking about. We are going to take the Power Commander 3 and we're going to just take the fuel parameters and increase it by 46%. If we change the fuel parameters by 46% and the PCM or powertrain control module can bring us back to stoichiometric, then that confirms my theory that although I changed things in the engine, the computer is making up for it. This is a GM diagnostic tune-up center, and it is capable of telling us what the air-fuel ratio coming out the tailpipe is. And that's exactly what we're doing. Right now at idle, in closed loop, so the engine's warmed up, we can see that we are around 14.5, which is roughly where you want to be for a good, efficient, clean burn. This meets emissions, this is efficient, it's just the amount of air to fuel that chemically makes sense. And that is where the engine wants to be, especially at idle. It doesn't want any more, it doesn't want any less, it just needs to be running. Now, if I was to go in and I was to increase the throttle, we're gonna watch and see what happens. Now the engine's running at a higher RPM. You should see that it's gonna get a little bit more rich, and then it's gonna start balancing itself back out to that 14.5 or stoichiometric range. Now, using the power of the PC3, we can change the amount of fuel that goes into this. But this is on top of what the engine's already doing. So we're telling the injectors to open for longer, but the computer in the Jeep is still trying to achieve that stoichiometric range, and so it's going to modify the pulses that it sends the injectors, which then we're modifying here, and eventually it should be able to balance out within a certain reason, right? If we're outside of its capable range of adjustment, then it won't ever be able to balance things out. But let's take a look and see if 46%, which is the absolute maximum that we could have done to this with the mods that we have, let's see if that is something that it can balance out. So we're going to Control A, we're going to select everything, and we're going to put 46% in here, which is just a ridiculous amount of fuel increase. This is going to open the injectors 40% more than what the computer is telling them. So now we can see that it has just jumped way into the 10 range for air to fuel ratio, but it's pulling itself back up and it is adjusting itself. And let's see if it can get back to where it started. Ooh, just a little bit on the rich side, but really it has achieved it. Okay, now that we have seen that the ECU can accommodate for up to 46% change with just a minor amount that it could not account for, we're gonna see how it reacts to the exact same increase in throttle. So what we just witnessed was, as I increased the throttle slowly, we're still within the closed loop parameters, meaning that the ECU is reading the O2 sensor and adjusting accordingly. And even with 46% change, we saw that it came back a little bit, but then it corrected right back into that 14.5 or just under. And so that's telling me that yes, the PCM can accommodate for changes all the way up to 46%. Now we are probably right on the limits of what this thing can do. Okay, now that we've seen that, you're probably wondering, what's the point? Why do we do any of these engine mods at all if they're not going to change any of the parameters in the engine? Well, I mentioned before open loop mode. Open loop mode doesn't have this feedback, and so it is static. It's going to stay the exact same. And so if you're in open loop mode, which, like I said before, is triggered by pushing on the throttle quickly or being at full throttle, which in this Jeep is a lot. That's a lot of the time. And so if you have your engine set up in a way to where you're fighting yourself, or like I have, where you're making it super extra lean in open loop mode, then you could actually be damaging your engine. I'm gonna blip the throttle, which will send us into open loop, and we're gonna see what it does to the air to fuel ratio. All right, look at that. You can see we went all the way down to almost 10, and now it's still in this range, and it's trying to correct, and here it goes. Now you can see it's back into closed loop because it's forcing its way back over to this 14.5 range. Now we just saw what blipping the throttle with 46% changes, but I didn't show you what it looks like when the map's at all zeros or stock parameters. And so let me show you what that looks like as well. Now we're coming over here and we didn't get quite as far because there's not quite as much fuel being put in there. So that's why the power commander is important. Maybe not if you have a stock engine, but if you're doing anything else to it, if you're taking your engine, you're adding a bigger throttle body to get more air, you have a header like I do to get that air out of there, or if you're putting in different injectors that are going to change how the fuel goes in, you're going to want to be able to adjust what happens inside your engine at open loop. Okay, so the Power Commander 3 is crucial for open loop mode, and open loop is when you're accelerating. Your Jeep goes into an acceleration loop, which would be an open loop. It's a preset parameter, and you're going to want the Power Commander 3 influencing that for sure. But what about closed loop mode? Now, I've been driving this with increased fuel for a little while now, and I've noticed that it seems to stutter less. And I think that what's happening here is I have it incredibly rich right now, and it has a lot more fuel. When the engine is preparing to accelerate, it's going to dump more fuel in there to make up for whatever pulse of air is going to come in. And you can see that when you blip the throttle with this Gunson installed. And I think that the reason why I'm noticing this increase in smoothness is because it works a little something like this. Whoa, I'm really lean. Need to increase fuel by 20%. Add 30% to that. Now I'm super rich. Decrease fuel by 20%. Add 30% to that. Ah, now we're lean again. Increase fuel by 20%. Add 30% to that. Seems about right. Keep it just the same. Add 30% to that. Okay, now we're rich again. Decrease fuel by 20%. Add 30% to that. So as the PCM bounces between rich and lean, the Power Commander is then going to bias the direction that it sways. And so you could find yourself, if it's trying to get more rich from a lean condition, it's going to get there a lot faster. Or if the Power Commander's enriching it, you're going to get to that lean condition a little bit slower. And it works the same way the other direction. If the Power Commander is leaning you out, you're going to get to the lean condition sooner and the rich condition slower. So you can bias your closed loop parameters, but it's not so much in how it's running, it's how fast the PCM is able to adjust the fuel parameters in any given direction. Okay, now that we've talked about what the Power Commander 3 is doing, we're gonna go back to the original project, which is we're gonna try and emulate what Jeff did on his Jeep, so that way we can verify his claims that it does indeed increase the power of the Jeep. Now, first we need to understand that there's a difference between mine and his Jeep. He has an aftermarket fuel pressure regulator, which is changing his fuel pressure to 45 psi, and he also has the vacuum hose disconnected so that his fuel pressure is constant across the board. It doesn't drop when he's at idle. And so if we take my max psi of 38 psi and his 45, and we divide 45 by 38, we get 1.26, or 100% plus 26%. And that means he has 26% more fuel than I do. When the injector opens for whatever amount of time, he's getting 26% more fuel. If it opens for 1 unit of time, 26% more. 5 units of time, 26% more. It's constant. And so we can use this 26% number and we can just apply it directly into the Power Commander. The Power Commander is adjusting percentages. And so it's going to say the computer wants to open the injector for 4 units of time. I want to change that by 10%. And so now it's 4.4. So I can take the 26% difference and I can just add that directly onto the map that I want to use. This is the map that came with the PC3, intended for a Suzuki motorcycle. And you can see that in the really low RPM, so we're talking like idle, 0% throttle. Throttle's across the top and RPM's on the side, by the way. So 0% throttle, idle, it's not going to change anything. The computer knows what's best. But when we start getting into these ranges here, which is going to be more of your like acceleration, especially here, this is like this box that I have kind of outlined is what I call normal driving. And that's from 20% throttle to 100% throttle in the 2250 to 3500 range. That's really where this engine lives the majority of its life, especially if you have an automatic transmission. This box here is when you're trying to get onto the highway or what have you. This is really your acceleration range right here. And I outlined that, and you can see that they've enriched it quite a bit. So this is what came with it. And when Jeff put this in his Jeep, he saw significant gains. Now, he has since said that this is not the best map for it. It's not the most ideal, but it did help. And so we want to prove out that first. Now, like I said before, his parameters are a little bit different than mine. And so what I've done is I've taken that exact map and I've increased it by 16% with the exception of the below idle and 0% throttle conditions. I left those at 0. And so now everything, instead of these being negative, they're positive now. And in that acceleration zone, we're seeing up to 30-40% increase. Now with the GTX 1000 map installed into the Power Commander, we're going to do a couple of throttle blips to certain RPMs to take a look at what that's doing to the air-fuel ratio. Keep in mind that I also have it modified at 26% increase to simulate having a higher pressure in the fuel rail. First test we're going to do is going to just 2000 RPM. We're going to do it slowly and then we're going to try and do it quickly if we can. That's about 2600 RPM. About 24% throttle. Now I'm going to go to about 50% throttle. We'll see what RPM we get to and we're going to see what we hit on here. That was 50% throttle, and we can see we're hitting about 11 for the air-to-fuel ratio. That put us in about 3000 RPM. Now we're going to do one more where I go just a little bit further. We'll see what I can get to. I'm going to aim for about 60 to 70% throttle. Or I'll miss it entirely and we'll hit 57. And so now with this map, we're going to do a 0 to 60 test and see how it compares to having no map at all. Okay guys, the 0 to 60 test. Now I have to lay out a whole bunch of disclaimers on this one because there's so much room for measurement error. So bear with me for just a minute. I'm going to name all the things I can think of that could have gone wrong in this test. The first one being that I started from a turn. I had to turn onto the road. We have variable wind. We had other cars on the road that I may or may not had to swerve around. Change in temperature between runs. My ability to keep my foot on the pedal and not distracted by other things. Driver consistency when shifting, when using the manual shift mode. And any number of other variables. Honestly, there's so many things that can change this data. It's incredibly difficult to get reliable 0 to 60 data, especially when you're just on a city street. Now I've done many 0 to 60 tests, but like we just discussed, there was a lot of variability. These two tests that I'm going to show you are the two that were the most similar between having a map installed and having no map installed on the PC3. So these two are the closest that we can compare to get the best data. I do plan on releasing a video where I show you all of the tests that I did so you can also make conclusions for yourself. if we look at these for just a moment, you can see in the graphs that there isn't a lot of definitive data. You can see in the video that there isn't a lot of definitive data, but the thing that stands out to me the most is if you look between 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour consistently, when we had the Power Commander at maps of zeros, meaning that it is back to stock parameters running this engine, we had a slower acceleration between 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour than when the PC3 was running the GSX 1000 tune that was biased to have 26% more fuel, as if I had a higher pressure fuel rail. Where I'm getting this from is if you look between 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour, the time it took to get to those, and you find the difference between those two times, that's how you can find the acceleration. You're increasing by 10 miles an hour, which is speed, and you're doing that over this amount of seconds. And you can see that out of all of the data that seems to jumble together, there's nothing consistent. This rings true throughout the entire test, that when I had the Power Commander biasing the engine with the GSX 1000 tune, my acceleration between 50 miles an hour and 60 miles an hour was always increased. And that rings hope. That means that we're on the right track. That means that there is room for improvement, and that we can improve it with the Power Commander 3. Now, from this data, I'm also concluding that this tune or this map probably isn't the best for this engine, but the beauty of it is we have the ability to tune it. Now that we've determined that the Power Commander 3 can not only affect how fuel is delivered to the engine, but also the performance of it as well, we can move forward with trying to find the best map for this engine transmission setup. In order to do this efficiently, I'm going to need a couple of tools, and I have mentioned this before. The first one being a wideband O2 sensor. They are about minimum of $150, and so I am launching a miniature campaign where I'm trying to raise that amount of money to purchase one of these for further testing. In order to follow along with this campaign, look for some of my comments in the community tab. If you go to the Jeep Sheep TV channel page and click on the community tab, you'll see I've been posting a lot of different things, stuff that we're working on, some polls that you can fill out, but most importantly, I'm going to be talking about how we're raising money for this wideband O2 sensor if you want to get involved with that. Additionally, I plan on releasing a Jeep Sheep TV store. Previously, it was on Facebook, and I understand not everyone has a Facebook account, and so now we're going to have a store website where we can start selling Jeep Sheep TV merchandise and a few gizmos that I've designed that I'll be coming out with later in the year. So as that comes out, I highly encourage you to go there. The community tab is the best place to find out about that. If you are interested in Jeep Sheep TV on other social media platforms, we also have a Facebook page, we have an Instagram, we have Patreon, we have Subscribestar, and we have a RevKit page, all of which are really great places to go. The Patreon and Subscribestar are if you want to support us, and the others are just additional information about projects that we're working on. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful for you, and I'll see you in the next video.